Be me, Christina, HR manager. Absolutely loving my position of power over these males. Finally have the authority to create real change in this patriarchal hellscape. Every hiring decision, every performance review, every termination is a chance to level the playing field. These men have had it too easy for too long. Start my morning reviewing termination paperwork for Peter, another underperforming male who clearly couldn't handle working under strong female leadership. His stellar performance reviews from previous years don't matter. Those were obviously written by the old boys club before I arrived. What matters is creating space for more qualified women. Walk into office feeling empowered. Immediately notice Peter cleaning out his desk. Perfect opportunity to reinforce why this was necessary. Approach with my most professional smile. Peter, I hope you understand this decision wasn't personal. The company is simply evolving beyond outdated performance standards. Peter stops packing, turns around with this look of complete disbelief. Outdated performance standards? Christina, I've exceeded every metric for 3 straight years. I brought in our biggest client just last month. Here we go, with the male fragility. They always think their so-called achievements entitle them to special treatment. Performance isn't just about numbers, Peter. It's about cultural fit, about fostering an inclusive environment where everyone can thrive. Cultural fit? I've never had a single HR complaint. I mentor junior developers regardless of gender. What exactly about my culture doesn't fit? He's getting that aggressive tone they always use when questioned. Probably never had a woman challenge his perceived superiority before. Look, I don't expect you to understand the nuances of modern workplace dynamics. The fact that you're becoming defensive proves my point about your inability to adapt to progressive leadership. Peter's face is getting red now. Typical male anger, when they can't intimidate their way out of consequences. Progressive leadership? You've fired 6 men in the past 18 months while promoting women with half their experience. Sarah got the team lead position despite being here 8 months compared to David's 4 years. Oh please, here comes the reverse discrimination narrative, as if these men have any concept of what real discrimination looks like. Sarah brings fresh perspectives and innovative approaches that, frankly, David lacks. Experience isn't just about time served, it's about bringing value that aligns with our forward-thinking culture. Forward-thinking culture? Christina, you literally told the entire engineering team last month that masculine communication styles were toxic and needed to be eliminated from our workplace. He was actually listening during that workshop. Surprising, given how most men just tune out when presented with uncomfortable truths. Masculine communication patterns have been proven to silence marginalized voices. Creating psychological safety requires dismantling systems that have historically favored aggressive, dominating behaviors. Peter starts laughing, but not the good kind. That bitter, entitled laugh men do when they realize their privilege is being checked. Psychological safety? Dave got written up for disagreeing with Linda's project timeline. Tom was sent to sensitivity training for using the word guys when addressing the team. Meanwhile, Jessica screamed at 3 different people last week and got praised for her passionate advocacy. Blah. Now he's just making things up, reframing normal accountability measures as somehow unfair. Those situations were handled appropriately based on their individual contexts. I wouldn't expect you to understand the complexity of equitable management practices. Individual contexts. The context is that you've created different rules for men and women. Every male employee walks on eggshells, while women can behave however they want without consequences. The persecution complex is strong with this one. Acting like basic workplace evolution is somehow oppressing him. What you're calling different rules is actually just equal treatment feeling unfair to people accustomed to systemic advantages. When you're used to privilege, equality feels like oppression. That's a good line. Definitely using that in my next presentation to leadership. Peter shakes his head and goes back to packing. You know what, Christina? I'm done trying to reason with you, but this isn't over. Ooh, threats now. How perfectly predictable. I hope for your sake that's not intended as intimidation, Peter. Threatening behavior toward HR personnel is grounds for legal action. Legal action? That's rich coming from you. We'll see who needs to worry about legal action. He storms off with his box of belongings, probably going to complain to his wife about the mean lady who held him accountable. Feel satisfied knowing I've made the workplace safer for everyone. One less toxic masculine presence poisoning our culture. Time to focus on identifying the next improvement opportunity. Spend rest of morning reviewing performance files. Stephen in accounting has been getting too comfortable lately. Keeps questioning budget allocations I've made for diversity initiatives. Obviously doesn't understand the investment required for meaningful change. His performance metrics are annoyingly good though. Going to need to be creative with the documentation. Start noting instances of resistance to change. and difficulty collaborating with diverse teams. Afternoon meeting with leadership about Q3 terminations. Need to present Peter's removal in terms they'll understand. Focus on team dynamics and cultural evolution rather than specific metrics. CEO Richard nods along as I explain the decision. Christina, Peter was one of our top performers. Are you sure this was the right call? Here we go with the old guard, protecting their favorites. Time to educate him about modern HR realities. Richard, performance in today's workplace isn't just about individual output. Peter was creating an environment where diverse team members felt marginalized and undervalued. That's concerning. Do we have documentation of specific incidents? Love how they always want paperwork for everything, as if systemic issues can be reduced to individual complaints. The patterns are subtle but persistent. Microaggressions, speaking over colleagues, dismissing innovative approaches that challenge traditional methods. These behaviors compound over time to create hostile environments. I see. Well, you're the expert on these matters. I trust your judgment. Exactly the response I was hoping for. Another convert to evidence-based management practices. Rest of week goes smoothly. Team productivity actually improves without Peter's negative energy. Proves my approach is working exactly as intended. Friday afternoon, get call from company lawyer Janet. Christina, we need to discuss a legal matter that's come up. Probably some routine compliance issue. Walk over to legal department, feeling confident. Janet looks unusually serious. We've been served with a federal civil rights lawsuit. Peter hired an attorney who's alleging systematic gender discrimination in our HR practices. Laugh immediately. These men and their victim complexes. That's ridiculous, Janet. Everything I've done has been to eliminate discrimination, not create it. Peter is obviously lashing out because he couldn't handle being held to higher standards. Christina, they're claiming a pattern of discriminatory termination spanning the past 2 years. They have documentation of 18 male employees who were terminated under questionable circumstances, while female employees with similar or worse performance were retained. 18 seems high, but each decision was justified based on cultural fit and team dynamics. Those terminations were all legitimate business decisions based on comprehensive performance evaluations. The fact that they involved male employees is coincidental. The lawsuit alleges that performance evaluations were manipulated to justify predetermined outcomes. They're requesting access to all personnel files, email communications, and documented review processes. My stomach drops slightly, but only because I know how lawyers can twist innocent documentation. My reviews follow established protocols and reflect genuine performance concerns. Any patterns are simply the result of addressing long-standing cultural issues that previous management ignored. Christina, I need you to walk me through your evaluation process. How do you determine when performance issues warrant termination versus coaching or improvement plans? Easy question. Just need to explain the holistic approach to performance management. I evaluate multiple factors beyond basic metrics: cultural alignment, collaborative approach, adaptability to modern workplace expectations. Traditional performance indicators often miss crucial behavioral patterns that impact team effectiveness. Can you give me specific examples of these behavioral patterns? Think back through recent cases. Peter's resistance to feedback, Stephen's questioning of budget decisions, David's outdated communication style. Resistance to progressive policies, undermining inclusive initiatives, perpetuating toxic masculine behaviors like aggressive communication or dismissing diverse perspectives. Janet takes detailed notes, probably preparing strong defense against frivolous claims. And female employees exhibiting similar behaviors received different treatment because, slightly loaded question but easy to address. Women expressing assertiveness or passion for their work is fundamentally different from men using dominating behaviors to maintain hierarchical advantages. Context matters in behavioral evaluation. I see. Christina, I'm going to need access to all your files and documentation. The attorney representing Peter appears to be quite thorough. Fine by me. My documentation clearly supports every decision I've made. Let them waste time trying to find problems with legitimate HR practices. Weekend passes normally. Confidence remains high about handling this frivolous lawsuit. Monday morning, get urgent call to come to Richard's office. Walk in to find Richard, Janet, and 2 men in suits I don't recognize. One introduces himself as company's external legal counsel. Christina, we've been reviewing your personnel files over the weekend. We need to discuss some concerning patterns that have emerged. Patterns. They keep using that word like it means something significant. I'm happy to clarify any questions about my management approach. Every decision has been carefully documented and professionally justified. External lawyer opens thick folder. Ms. Christina, we've identified 43 male employees who received negative performance reviews or termination during your tenure, compared to 7 female employees. Can you explain this disparity? 43 seems high, but reflects the scope of cultural transformation needed. Those numbers reflect the reality of addressing long-standing workplace issues. Many male employees struggled to adapt to evolved standards and expectations. Yet during this same period, you hired or promoted 61 women compared to 12 men, despite roughly equal application pools. How do you account for this hiring pattern? Good hiring means prioritizing candidates who will contribute positively to team culture. I prioritize candidates who demonstrate collaborative skills, emotional intelligence, and commitment to inclusive workplace values. These qualities were more prevalent among female applicants. Richard interrupts with frustrated tone. Christina, Peter's attorney has subpoenaed email communications between you and other HR personnel. Some of these communications are problematic. My emails are professional and focused on legitimate business objectives. Not sure what could be problematic about that. External lawyer reads from printout. Quote, another day, another opportunity to thin the toxic masculine herd. Stephen's resistance to our diversity budget proves he's not aligned with company values. Does this sound professional to you? That was obviously taken out of context, part of larger conversation about cultural evolution. That communication reflected frustration with employees undermining important initiatives. It's natural to express concerns about resistance to positive change. Quote, David's promotion request denied. 4 years experience doesn't matter if it's 4 years of perpetuating outdated masculine leadership styles. Sarah brings fresh energy this team desperately needs. Perfectly reasonable justification for merit-based promotion decisions. Sarah was objectively the stronger candidate based on modern leadership competencies. Experience alone doesn't qualify someone for advancement. Quote, Peter thinks his sales numbers entitle him to special treatment. Time to show him that accountability applies to everyone, especially overconfident men who think rules don't apply to them. Okay, that one sounds worse without proper context, but still reflects legitimate performance management concerns. Peter displayed entitlement issues that needed addressing. His attitude was becoming problematic for team morale. Janet looks mortified. Richard appears angry. External lawyer continues reading. Quote, performance reviews are our most powerful tool for reshaping workplace culture. Every negative review for toxic males creates space for qualified women to advance. Does this represent fair performance evaluation practices? That's completely twisted, obviously referring to natural consequences of merit-based assessment. That statement reflects the reality that removing underperforming employees creates opportunities for better candidates. It's basic workforce optimization. Ms. Christina, these communications suggest predetermined bias rather than objective evaluation. Combined with the statistical patterns, they paint a troubling picture of discriminatory practices. This is getting ridiculous. They're criminalizing efforts to create equitable workplace culture. My practices have been consistent with modern HR standards and diversity best practices. If creating inclusive environments is now considered discriminatory, then the legal system needs updating. Richard explodes. Christina, you've exposed this company to massive legal liability through your personal crusade. These aren't diversity best practices, they're illegal hiring and firing practices. Typical male reaction when challenged on outdated thinking. Even Richard falls back on aggressive tactics when threatened. Richard, I understand this is stressful, but we can't let fear of frivolous lawsuits prevent us from making necessary cultural improvements. Standing up to discrimination sometimes requires difficult decisions. Difficult decisions? You systematically targeted male employees for termination while giving female employees preferential treatment. That's textbook discrimination. He's completely missing the point about correcting historical imbalances. What you're calling preferential treatment is actually leveling a playing field that's been tilted toward men for decades. True equality requires intentional action to correct systemic advantages. External lawyer interjects. Ms. Christina, federal employment law doesn't recognize correcting historical imbalances as justification for present discrimination. Your actions appear to violate multiple civil rights statutes. Civil rights statutes written by and for the benefit of historically privileged groups. Using them to prevent actual equality is peak legal system irony. Those statutes were designed to protect marginalized groups, not perpetuate existing power structures. Using them to attack diversity initiatives perverts their intended purpose. The law prohibits discrimination based on gender, regardless of which gender benefits. Your communications and actions demonstrate clear bias against male employees based solely on their gender. They keep saying bias like it's automatically bad. Correcting systemic injustice requires acknowledging group-level patterns. What you're calling bias is actually informed awareness of how gender dynamics impact workplace culture. Ignoring these realities perpetuates inequality. Richard stands up, clearly losing patience. Christina, you're fired. Effective immediately. Security will escort you out. Shocked by this sudden escalation, thought he understood the importance of supporting progressive HR practices. Richard, you're making a huge mistake. Caving to legal pressure from disgruntled employees sends terrible message about company values. The only mistake was trusting you with HR authority. Your actions have put us in legal jeopardy and violated everything we stand for as an organization. Security appears at door. Can't believe they're actually doing this. This is exactly the kind of retaliation that proves why strong diversity measures are necessary. You're firing me for challenging male privilege. We're firing you for systematic discrimination and illegal employment practices. There's a difference. Walk out in stunned silence. Never expected such betrayal from leadership I was trying to protect. Next few weeks, a nightmare. News of lawsuit spreads through professional networks. Former colleagues avoid contact. Job applications get rejected without explanation. Peter's attorney contacts me directly. Ms. Christina, we're prepared to add you personally to the federal lawsuit unless you're willing to cooperate with our investigation. Decide to meet with him. Confident I can explain the context behind my decisions. Attorney's office is intimidating. Peter sits across table looking vindicated. Attorney, Kevin, has files covering entire conference table. Ms. Christina, we've documented a pattern of discriminatory behavior spanning 2 years. 18 terminated male employees, 43 negative reviews for men versus 7 for women, and communications clearly showing gender-based bias, still trying to criminalize legitimate workforce improvement. Those numbers reflect necessary cultural adjustments. Every decision was based on legitimate performance and behavioral concerns. Let's review specific cases. Thomas in marketing, terminated after receiving promotion just 6 months earlier. His sales exceeded targets by 30%, yet you documented attitude problems and resistance to collaborative leadership. Serious. Thomas was constantly undermining team meetings with aggressive questioning. Thomas displayed disruptive behaviors that impacted team productivity. Sales numbers don't excuse toxic interpersonal conduct. Yet Lisa in the same department, whose sales were 20% below target, received exceeds expectations for her innovative communication style and positive team energy. Can you explain this disparity? Lisa brought collaborative energy that elevated entire team performance. Lisa's contributions extended beyond individual metrics. She fostered inclusive environment that benefited everyone. Ms. Christina, we have testimony from 12 former employees describing hostile work environment specifically targeting men. Comments about toxic masculinity, mandatory sensitivity training only for male staff, and differential enforcement of workplace policies. Those employees obviously coordinated their stories to support Peter's narrative. Sensitivity training was offered to employees who needed development in modern communication skills. It's not my fault that mostly applied to male staff. Kevin pulls out thick binder. We've obtained your email communications with corporate HR discussing strategic workforce rebalancing and accelerated cultural evolution. In one email, you explicitly state your goal to reduce male representation to appropriate levels. That was part of larger diversity initiative discussion, taken completely out of context. Those communications discussed legitimate diversity goals. Every major corporation has targets for inclusive representation. Inclusive representation doesn't mean systematically removing existing employees based on gender. That's exactly what federal employment law prohibits. The law clearly needs updating to address modern workplace realities. Federal employment law was written for different era. Modern diversity science shows that achieving equity sometimes requires targeted interventions. Peter finally speaks up. Targeted interventions? Christina, you destroyed careers and livelihoods because you decided men didn't belong in our workplace. That's not diversity, that's discrimination. Here comes the victim narrative again. Peter, you lost your job because you couldn't adapt to evolved workplace standards. Taking responsibility for your own shortcomings would be more productive than blaming others. Evolved standards? You mean the standards where Jessica could scream at subordinates while I got written up for saying, "Hey guys," to my team? Totally different situations with different contextual factors. Jessica was advocating passionately for important projects. Your language use reinforced exclusionary patterns that marginalized team members. Marginalized team members? My team was 60% women, and they all said they felt included and respected. Your sensitivity training coordinator admitted you never received a single complaint about my communication style. Complaints aren't the only measure of problematic behavior. Many issues operate below the surface. Microaggressions often go unreported because marginalized employees fear retaliation. Absence of formal complaints doesn't indicate absence of harm. Kevin interjects again. Ms. Christina, Federal investigators have been reviewing your practices. The Department of Labor is prepared to file criminal charges for systematic civil rights violations. Criminal charges seem extreme for HR management decisions. Criminal charges for employment decisions? That's prosecutorial overreach designed to intimidate diversity advocates. Discriminatory employment practices are federal crimes when they demonstrate systematic intent to deny equal opportunity based on protected characteristics. Your documented statements and actions meet that standard. This legal system is completely backwards, criminalizing efforts to achieve actual equality while protecting existing privilege. The legal system needs to evolve beyond protecting historically advantaged groups from accountability. Real justice requires dismantling systemic barriers. Ms. Christina, do you feel any remorse for the harm your actions caused to terminated employees and their families? Remorse for improving workplace culture and creating opportunities for qualified women. I feel satisfied that I took meaningful action to address workplace inequality. The terminated employees will benefit from learning to adapt to modern standards. Peter looks incredulous. Satisfied? Christina, James lost his house because he couldn't find work after you fired him. David's wife left him because of the stress. Stephen had to pull his kids out of private school. You destroyed families over your personal ideology. Those men should have considered consequences before resisting positive change. Personal struggles resulting from termination are unfortunate, but don't invalidate the necessity of cultural evolution. Adaptation requires temporary discomfort. Temporary discomfort? You cost 18 men their livelihoods and damaged dozens of careers through manipulated reviews. That's not discomfort, that's devastation. They're being overly dramatic about normal workforce transitions. Workforce evolution always involves displacement. The responsibility lies with individuals to develop skills and attitudes that align with contemporary expectations. Kevin closes his files. Ms. Christina, your complete lack of remorse and continued justification of discriminatory behavior will be noted in our federal filing. Criminal prosecution will proceed. Criminal prosecution for HR management seems like massive overreach. This prosecution represents backlash against diversity progress. History will vindicate my efforts to create equitable workplaces. Leave attorney's office feeling confident about eventual vindication. Progressive movements always face initial resistance from entrenched systems. 6 months later, sitting in federal courtroom as defendant. Charges include conspiracy to violate civil rights, systematic employment discrimination, and fraud related to manipulated performance reviews. Prosecutor presents overwhelming evidence. 18 terminated men, 43 manipulated reviews, documented email communications showing intent to discriminate. My attorney argues cultural evolution and diversity advancement. Jury seems skeptical of explanations. Peter testifies about career destruction and family impacts. Other terminated employees share similar stories. They make it sound like personal vendetta rather than professional management. Take stand in my own defense. Opportunity to explain progressive HR methodology to jury. Every decision I made was intended to create more inclusive, equitable workplace culture. The terminated employees struggled to adapt to evolved standards that prioritized collaboration over domination. Prosecutor cross-examines aggressively. Ms. Christina, you testified that male employees struggled to adapt. Did you provide equal coaching and development opportunities to help them adapt? Coaching was available to employees who demonstrated genuine commitment to change. I provided resources and feedback to employees who showed willingness to evolve. Unfortunately, many male employees resisted these development opportunities. Yet testimony shows female employees received extensive mentoring and support, while male employees were written up for identical behaviors. How do you explain this disparity? Different employees require different approaches based on their specific needs and challenges. Effective management requires tailored approaches. Female employees needed encouragement to overcome historical barriers, while male employees needed accountability for privileged behaviors. Privileged behaviors? Can you define what constitutes privileged behavior in workplace setting? Easy question about fundamental diversity concepts. Privileged behaviors include dominating conversations, dismissing diverse perspectives, resisting inclusive policies, and perpetuating masculine communication styles that marginalize others. Did you apply these same standards to female employees? For instance, when Jessica screamed at subordinates, did you consider that dominating behavior? Jessica's situation was completely different context. Jessica was advocating for important initiatives under stressful circumstances. Context matters in behavioral evaluation. So the same behavior is acceptable from women, but not from men. They're deliberately misunderstanding the complexity of power dynamics. Behavior must be evaluated within historical and systemic contexts. Women asserting themselves operates differently than men reinforcing existing advantages. Ms. Christina, Federal employment law prohibits different standards based on gender. Do you acknowledge violating this legal requirement? Federal employment law fails to account for systemic inequality and necessary corrective measures. I followed progressive HR practices designed to achieve actual equality rather than maintain existing disparities. Sometimes, legal compliance conflicts with moral imperative. Prosecutor presents email evidence. My communications about thinning the herd and strategic workforce rebalancing sound worse when read aloud in courtroom. Closing arguments focus on systematic nature of discrimination. Defense emphasizes diversity advancement and cultural progress. Jury deliberates for 6 hours. Return guilty verdict on all charges. Sentencing hearing 3 weeks later. Facing potential federal prison time for employment discrimination. Judge reviews evidence of systematic bias, manipulated reviews, and complete lack of remorse. Ms. Christina, your actions represent serious abuse of authority and systematic violation of civil rights. Your continued justification of discriminatory behavior shows no understanding of the harm caused. Address court about importance of progressive change. Your Honor, my actions were necessary to address historical workplace inequality. Punishing diversity advocates sends chilling message about our commitment to justice. Ms. Christina, discrimination is discrimination regardless of motivation. Federal law protects all workers from systematic bias, including male workers. I sentence you to 18 months federal prison and 5 years supervised probation. 18 months seems excessive for employment management decisions. Appeals process takes additional year. Conviction upheld at every level. Legal system clearly invested in protecting traditional power structures. Enter federal prison, still believing in rightness of my actions. Cellmate asks what I'm in for. Employment discrimination, apparently. I made hiring and firing decisions to create more equitable workplace, but the legal system criminalizes diversity advancement. So you fired people for being men? She completely misses the complexity of systemic change efforts. I removed employees who perpetuated toxic workplace cultures and couldn't adapt to inclusive standards. Their gender was coincidental. Sounds like you fired them for being men. That's messed up. Even prisoners don't understand progressive employment practices. 18 months in prison provides time to reflect on broader systemic issues. Realize the entire legal and corporate structure is designed to prevent meaningful change. Release after serving full sentence. Professional prospects completely destroyed. Disbarred from HR practice. Blacklisted from corporate positions. Forced to take minimum wage retail job to survive. Co-workers don't know about criminal background, but skills feel wasted on menial tasks. Occasionally see news about former company. They hired traditional HR director who reversed all my diversity initiatives. Male hiring and promotion rates returned to previous levels. Exactly the regression I predicted. Peter found new job and rebuilt career. Other terminated employees also recovered professionally. They got book deals and speaking opportunities about workplace discrimination. Media portrays them as civil rights heroes. My story gets framed as cautionary tale about extremist ideology. 5 years later, still on probation, struggling financially and professionally, but convinced that history will eventually vindicate progressive employment practices. Watch diversity initiatives continue advancing in corporate America. Other HR professionals learn from my experience to be more subtle in implementation. Maybe my sacrifice helped educate others about necessity of strategic approach to workplace equity. Change is slow, but inevitable. My methods were ahead of their time, but ultimately correct. Probation officer asks about employment prospects. Christina, have you considered that your approach to workplace diversity might have been fundamentally flawed? Typical question from someone who doesn't understand systemic change requirements. My approach was necessary given the scope of inequality I was addressing. The punishment was disproportionate to the actions taken. 18 men lost their jobs unfairly. Don't you feel responsible for that harm? Those men would have eventually been displaced by natural workforce evolution anyway. Workforce transitions are always difficult. My actions accelerated necessary changes that would have happened eventually through market forces. But you manipulated performance reviews and applied different standards based on gender. That's not workforce evolution, that's discrimination. They keep using that word like it automatically invalidates progressive change efforts. Discrimination implies unjustified differential treatment. My actions were justified by the need to correct historical imbalances and create equitable opportunities. Do you think you'll ever acknowledge the harm you caused? Harm is subjective and must be weighed against broader social benefits. I acknowledge that individuals experience difficulty adjusting to necessary changes, but preventing systemic progress causes greater long-term harm to society. 5 years of probation finally end. Criminal record permanent but legal restrictions lifted. Apply for basic office positions. Background checks eliminate most opportunities, forced to continue retail work indefinitely. Occasionally encounter former colleagues at professional events. They avoid conversation and seem uncomfortable. Attend diversity workshop out of curiosity. Facilitator discusses avoiding discriminatory practices while advancing inclusion. Raise hand during Q&A. How do we achieve meaningful diversity without taking decisive action against entrenched resistance? Facilitator recognizes me and quickly moves to different question. Realize I've become cautionary example in HR training materials. My case study used to teach what not to do in diversity initiatives. Watch as other organizations implement subtle, gradual approaches to workforce change. Progress is slower, but avoids legal challenges. Maybe they learned appropriate lessons from my experience. 10 years after conviction, still working retail. Never found pathway back to professional career, but remain convinced about correctness of original approach. Read about ongoing workplace inequality studies. Gender disparities persist despite decades of diversity programs. Proves that gradual approaches aren't sufficient for systemic change. Occasionally get interview requests from researchers studying employment discrimination. Opportunity to explain progressive methodology to academic audiences. Dr. Williams, my case demonstrates the legal system's investment in protecting traditional workplace hierarchies. Meaningful change requires bold action that challenges existing power structures. Ms. Christina, but your actions clearly violated federal employment law. How can illegal discrimination advance equality? Academics still don't understand the distinction between justified and unjustified differential treatment. Federal employment law was written to maintain existing advantages for historically privileged groups. True equality requires moving beyond legal frameworks designed to prevent progress. So you believe discrimination laws shouldn't apply when targeting historically advantaged groups? They keep trying to trap me with semantic arguments about discrimination. I believe justice requires acknowledging historical context and taking corrective action. Laws that prevent such action perpetuate inequality. But 18 men lost their livelihoods. Don't their individual rights matter? Individual rights must be balanced against collective advancement and social justice. Individual disruption is unfortunate but necessary for broader systemic change. Those men will ultimately benefit from living in more equitable society. You show no remorse for the personal harm your actions caused. How do you justify that? Remorse implies wrongdoing, which requires accepting flawed legal and social frameworks. I feel satisfaction that I took meaningful action against workplace inequality. Remorse would require abandoning principles of justice and equity. Interview ends with researcher looking disturbed. Probably another person who can't handle challenging traditional assumptions. 15 years later, working same retail job, health declining from stress and limited resources. But still believe in righteousness of original mission. Hear about Supreme Court cases limiting affirmative action programs. Exactly the regression I predicted from legal backlash against diversity progress. Younger co-workers sometimes ask about my background. Why does someone with college degree work here permanently? Explain about career in human resources and commitment to social justice. I challenged systemic inequality in corporate environment and faced retaliation from entrenched power structures. So you got fired for being too woke? They reduce complex issues to oversimplified political labels. I was criminally prosecuted for implementing progressive employment practices. The case demonstrates how legal system protects existing privilege. That sucks. Systems totally rigged against people trying to make change. Finally, someone who understands the broader context of my experience. Watch new generation of diversity advocates entering workforce. They're more cautious and strategic than my generation. Learn from our mistakes about timing and implementation. Maybe my sacrifice provided valuable lessons for future progress. Change requires both bold pioneers and strategic implementers. History will recognize my contribution to advancing workplace equity. 20 years after conviction, still at same retail job. Never married, few friends, limited prospects, but maintained dignity and principles throughout ordeal. Retire early due to health problems, small apartment, limited savings, social isolation. But conscience clear about fighting good fight. Write memoir about experience during final years. Principled resistance, one woman's stand against workplace inequality. Self-published through online platform. Few sales, mostly negative reviews. Readers don't appreciate complexity of progressive change efforts. Die alone but unrepentant. Obituary mentions criminal conviction without context. Legacy defined by legal system rather than moral principles. Never learned to question whether systematically firing men was actually discrimination. Never developed empathy for individuals harmed by ideological zealotry. Never recognized difference between equality and revenge. Took no responsibility for abuse of power. showed zero growth or wisdom from experience, remained convinced until death that everyone else was wrong, believed history would vindicate systematic gender discrimination, died bitter and alone, destroyed by her own hatred, learned nothing, changed nothing, accomplished nothing, except harm.